Hello everyone, welcome back. Today's video we're going to be discussing Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronté, published in 1847. Part 1. Summary. Jane Eyre chronicles the coming of age of the titular character, a young orphan who starts the novel in the care of her cruel aunt, where she is subjected to her aunt's cruelties, along with the cruelties of her belligerent son. From there, we follow Jane as she goes to an impoverished boarding school, and then gets a job as a governess, where she meets the enigmatic and brooding Mr. Rochester, who she slowly falls in love with. Throughout her journey through life, Jane is met by various forces that try to oppress her sense of individuality and self. Jane Eyre is a story of individuality and autonomy in the face of these forces. Part 2. A powerful protagonist. Okay, so I want to start this video by talking about what I think is the strongest aspect of this book, and that is the protagonist, Jane herself. I think Jane Eyre is a wonderful protagonist. She's strong, and she has her own sense of self, and she's someone who, regardless of your gender, you could look up to as a reader. From the start of the novel, we see her standing up for herself against the abuses of her aunt and her cousin James. Her aunt seems obsessed with saying that she's a terrible, horrible child who is disgusting, and she has a blind spot for her own son who she thinks is this great person. And Jane just won't take any of this. She's always standing up for herself and calling people out, the adults around her, who are trying to make her out to be something that she isn't. I think in these early chapters, it really reminds me of when I was growing up, and I imagine lots of you as well, where, especially if you've got brothers and sisters, where you'll get in a scrape with one of them, and the parents will take the side of one child, and they'll treat you as if you're, a terrible person, and you just feel so in this sense of injustice from your parents when they, blame you for doing something that you haven't done, or say you're a horrible child for something that you haven't done. Charlotte Bronté does a really good job of capturing that sense of injustice that children have. And I think it's something that not only is done well, but something that most people can relate to as readers. Although a lot of people see Jane Eyre as a good role model for girls, I think she's equally a good role model for boys as well. Especially in these early chapters. Anyone that has been in a position where they are being wrongfully accused of things as a child can really relate to Jane as a character. And regardless of whether you're male or female, having a character like that who is strong and powerful, who stands up for herself, is always a good role model, regardless of whether you share the same gender with them. One thing though that does strike me as on the topic of gender is that it is kind of rare in classics to get a novel that actually focuses on a young girl as opposed to a young boy. A lot of other classics that have a similar setup to Jane Eyre, where you have the young child at the beginning and throughout the novel they mature. Sometimes you see them as an adult, or sometimes you just see them a bit later on in their childhood. But oftentimes it's a male character rather than a female one. Ones that stand out in my mind are things like Oliver Twist, or David Copperfield, or The Adventures of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. It's always young boys and rarely young girls. So it is nice to have a classic book that deals with this from a female perspective, and we have a female protagonist that we follow. And that's definitely something that makes this one stand out amongst all these other classic coming-of-age stories. I actually can't think of any classics off the top of my head that do really focus on a girl's odyssey as she's growing up. But if any of you have any recommendations, let me know, because I would like to read more of this kind of book. Another great thing about the protagonist, and this is more about the way that Charlotte portrays the protagonist, is her narrative voice and the familiarity in which you, as a reader, feel with Jane throughout the novel, because of that narrative voice. So Charlotte Bronté is credited with being one of the first novelists to really focus on using a first-person narrative in a very intimate and psychological way. This isn't to say that she was the first person to use the first-person narration, but it is to say that what she does really well is she really makes you feel an intimate connection with the inner feelings and thoughts of Jane Eyre. And I think this is part of what makes Jane such a good character as well. It's not just that she's so strong and powerful as a character, and she's got this sense of identity about her. It's that the way she speaks to the reader just gives you a strong sense of knowing this person very intimately and very deeply. In fact, much of the novel isn't really focused on the plot elements, although there is certainly a plot there. Oftentimes we're just focusing on Jane and what she's thinking about situations as she's reflecting on them and working out what she's going to do. So we do spend a lot of time in Jane's head, and again all this allows us to build a really big, colourful picture of her character. What I find most interesting about this is that I often find that sometimes in first-person narration, even though you have a first-person narrator there who is talking to you and about themselves directly, oftentimes that first-person narrator can be very kind of background and not much of a character themselves. Oftentimes they're just kind of a passive person who's just describing the events going around them. I'm thinking here of characters like Nick from The Great Gatsby. They're not really fleshed out, and we don't spend that much time in their heads. We spend much more time focusing on what's happening out there. Whereas with Jane, this is completely the opposite. Even though it's first-person narration, we really do spend a lot of time in her head and with her thoughts. So instead of getting a bland first-person narrator, which I would say is more common, you end up with a very colourful and interesting first-person narrator. If any of you are budding writers out there, I would definitely recommend reading Jane Eyre just so that you can see how well she has constructed a first-person narrator. So overall then, Jane is a fantastic character to follow. She is a powerful character, she's got her own sense of self, and not only that, but she is really well written by Charlotte Bronté. The intimate style of narration is just great, and it really builds a colourful, vibrant picture of the person that you're following. Part 2. An implausible plot. So now to something that I didn't like as much as the character work, and that is the plot. Now, the early parts of the plot with Jane as a child I actually really liked, and I also like the plot where she's at school and she's meeting people there and we have a friendship that she develops there. All this stuff was good, but when we actually meet Mr. Rochester and we go on from there, the plot just seemed to get a bit improbable. Now, as someone who reads a lot of Gothic fiction, and just classics in general, it seems to me that you do get a lot of circumstantial happenings and reveals of, plot twists where people are revealed to be long-lost family members and all this kind of stuff. And while that does happen to a great extent in a lot of classic fiction, it does happen a bit too often in this book to really give me a sense of a believable plot. The most ridiculous of these is when Jane leaves her job as a governess, goes out on outside in the cold, and like in most of these old novels, if you go out in the cold, you're going to get ill. So she does that, she finds someone who helps her, and these people turn out to be long-lost relatives. And it's just so unbelievably silly that it's hard to really buy into what's going on. We also have, towards the end of the book, a scene that I think does sometimes take a lot of flack, which is when Jane is away from Mr. Rochester, she's got this new life going, but she does still want to sort of get back to him at some point, and she sees some manifestation of him that tells her to come back, and it's just, again, because the novel is, up to this point, has been quite realist, it's weird that this is the thing that encourages Jane to go back to Mr. Rochester. Especially because she's been thinking about it for a long time, and we know she's a strong character, so it would have just made sense to have just had her go and find him at some point, rather than having this weird quasi-supernatural thing going on. So there were a couple of things in the book, plot-wise, that I just thought were a bit improbable, a bit silly, and they did kind of rub off the wrong way, I guess. I think really what the strongest aspect of Jane Eyre is that focusing on character, and in particular Jane and her inner thoughts. When we're doing that, the novel's at its best, and when we're thinking about the plot, it does dip a bit in quality for me. Although, again, this is just something that's par for the course with classic novels, and you just have to deal with it as a modern reader. Part 3. Secondary characters. So I want to talk a bit about the secondary characters as well as Jane. I think that Jane is the most fully realised character, and that makes sense because we're spending time in her head, so we get a much more complete picture of her. And the fact that Charlotte Bronté is spending so much time in Jane's head means that your perception of the other characters is somewhat interesting but also frustrating at times. I'm going to use Mr. Rochester as a prime example of these two things, how it can be frustrating but also interesting. It feels to me as a reader that you never really understand Mr. Rochester. In every scene with him and Jane, he shows a different dimension to his personality. And there were certain scenes where I thought, is this going to be some kind of patriarchal male who's going to, eventually be a tyrannical, horrible person to Jane? But then there are other scenes where he's kind of playful and fun, and other scenes where he's quite tender and kind. So you end up with a very conflicted idea of who this character is. And a lot of this is because, we're confined to Jane's perspective of Mr. Rochester, and she's quite confused about his character for a lot of the book. And that's really interesting in terms of a story, because then you end up with this character who's a bit of an enigma, because you never really understand what's going on. Now, if you like a book where you can really get a concrete sense of a character, that might frustrate you because a lot of the side characters are mediated through Jane, and if she's not really focusing on that character very much, they might not have much of a personality, whereas if she is focusing on them a bit more, like Mr. Rochester, you get a lot, but at the same time, it's very conflicted and confusing. So you might not like that as a reader, but I think in terms of the novel, in terms of what the novel is doing, it's actually a good thing. Not only does it tell us things about Jane, for instance, her relationship with her aunt, who is someone that she dislikes, she then sees her aunt always in this negative way, and we never really get a moment to sympathise or empathise with the aunt. Even when she's on her deathbed, she's still a cruel, horrible person. Even though Jane tries to forgive her, the aunt just doesn't want it. And likewise with Mr. Rochester. Because Jane is so confused about her feelings towards him for most of the book, the way in which we see Mr. Rochester is also very confused throughout the book, depending on how Jane is feeling in the moment. One thing that I will say, though, about Mr. Rochester and Jane and their relationship here, is that I wasn't really sure if I bought into the chemistry there. It really felt to me like Jane was interested in him, like, in a academic sort of way, like curious to know more about him. But there was never really a moment in the text where I really felt like they clicked. It almost felt like she just decided at some point that she was in love with him. It felt very abstract and rational, rather than grounded in any kind of feeling. If I'm comparing this to the other Bronte novels that I've read, so say the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff, where you really get the sense right from when they're children that they are passionate about each other. And likewise with the lovers in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Anne Bronte spends a lot of time developing the relationship in a way that makes sense. It really makes sense when Helen falls for the abusive guy, and we understand why she would do that. Whereas in Jane Eyre, I just didn't feel like the main love was really set up very well. I didn't buy the chemistry there, although I did find the relationship dynamic that they had quite interesting, and I did find Jane's reflections and thoughts about Mr. Rochester very interesting. So ultimately, the secondary characters are a mixed bag, because it really depends in terms of how fleshed out they are, how Jane feels about them. If they're someone who's a big person in Jane's life, then they're going to have more fleshed out, they're going to be more interesting. So that's why Mr. Rochester is such an enigmatic character, whereas maybe, background characters are just a bit generic. But I think that's ultimately a good thing, because it's believable in the context of the book. It's a personal story, and if you're telling a personal story, there are going to be a certain set of people in your life that you really focus on, you want to talk about them, and there are going to be other people that are there, but they're not really, they're background people in your life, either because you don't like them or they're just not playing a big role in the things that are going on. And so even if some of the secondary characters aren't as well fleshed out, it does make sense within the novel and what the novel is doing. Part 4. Autonomy and freedom. So when I was reading Jane Eyre, the central theme that I really picked up on was autonomy. A bit like The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, I felt like the message of these two books was quite similar. It's this idea that the protagonists, in both cases, really want to be able to live their own life on their own terms. They don't want to have their lives dictated for them or by anyone else. We see this with Jane right at the beginning of the novel, when she's standing up for herself, when she's being blamed of things that she hasn't done, when she's telling her aunt that she's a terrible person for abusing her. We really see that she does not want to be oppressed by these forces. We also see this again when Jane goes to school and we have a friendship between her and another schoolgirl called Helen. Now Helen is a very interesting character and she only appears in the school chapters, and she is a nice, studious girl, but she allows herself to be constantly picked on and nagged at and kind of abused, at least verbally, I think physically as well, by the teachers. And she just goes along with it. And ultimately, Helen is one of the characters when tuberculosis comes to the school, she catches it and she dies. Whereas Jane doesn't. She doesn't even, I don't think she gets ill. She survives, she comes through because she's standing up for herself. It's kind of a metaphorical thing here going on. The person who is weak, who's allowing people to oppress them, is ultimately going to fail or die, and the person who is strong-willed, who is fighting back, will thrive. The key battle, though, that Jane faces comes towards the last third of the novel, when she gets reunited with some of her family members, and one of these family members is called St. James, and he's a member of the clergy. What's interesting about the relationship between these two is that St. James seems to treat Jane Eyre like an equal. He has two other sisters who he always hugs, and he does all the kind of things that you would do, to a lady back in the day. Whereas with Jane, he always shakes her hand. And so you think, as you're reading this, that he kind of respects Jane and sees her as an equal. But then, later in the novel, St. James decides he wants to emigrate to India, to do missionary work there, and he wants Jane to come with him. But he will only let her come with him if she marries him, because it's weird to have a single woman and a single man, even if they're related to each other, go abroad and live there. Or at least that's his explanation for it, which to me just sounds absurd, but believable within the context of the time. And Jane just does not react to this well, as you can imagine. She doesn't see why she would have to get married in order to go there. She agrees that she would go with him if she didn't have to marry him. But for her, marriage is about you being in love with someone and choosing that person, rather than doing it for social reasons or political reasons or whatever. Now, some people have suggested that this means that the book is somewhat anti-religious, because here we see Jane rejecting a religious man and religious work in order to, be in love with someone and marry Mr. Rochester, the guy that she loves. And I think definitely that's a valid interpretation, but I think more strongly is this sense of just not wanting to be controlled by external forces, not wanting to be forced into a marriage for non-love reasons, and not wanting to be forced into any situation really where you don't feel like that's the thing that you want to do. Now obviously, in terms of the time. That does mean it is against religion to an extent, because religion is somewhat oppressive in that way. But I think, given the more broad themes in the book as well, it is more that it's just about always wanting to choose things for yourself and be your own self-governing person, than letting other people choose for you. And what makes this even more interesting for me is that it's not just Jane who is a victim to these forces. Mr. Rochester himself, we learn in the book, has a wife who is insane and rich, and Mr. Rochester was forced into this marriage by his family. He was basically tricked into it because his dad wanted him to marry someone with a bit of money. And so, and this obviously ends terribly. Mr. Rochester is stuck in a very unhappy relationship with this woman. And again, it's just another example here of how society at the time was trying to force men and women into these boxes, into these roles, whether that's as a bride or as a husband or whatever. And it's damaging. It's ultimately damaging. It makes Mr. Rochester a bitter and somewhat cruel person until Jane comes along. But throughout the novel, we always see Jane resisting these forces, whether she's doing it as a child against her aunt, or at school against the guy that runs the school, who again tries to paint her out to be a person that she isn't, and then again and again throughout the novel. Now, the idea of freedom as a central part of the story is something that we see a lot, but what I like about this book in particular is that oftentimes when freedom is a aspect or a theme of a book like this, it ends with the protagonist just rejecting everything and just completely detaching themselves from any kind of society or happiness, I would say. What's nice in this book is that it's not so much that Jane wants to detach herself completely from society. She ultimately gets married and becomes kind of a housewife in a typical sort of fashion. But what matters isn't the outcome. It isn't that she gets married. It isn't that she chooses to look after Mr. Rochester after his accident. It's that she does it on her own terms. It's that she decides that this is what she wants in her life. And although what she wants might be something that's quite traditional, the fact is she's still chosen that. She hasn't had it chosen for her by anyone else. And I think that's a very interesting way to resolve the plot. And again, not something you get very often, at least, in novels that are focusing on freedom as a theme. Although I have heard that in the next book that Charlotte Bronté wrote, Villette, the protagonist does have that rejection. So it'll be interesting to read that one and compare it with this one and see how the two protagonists match up with each other. Part 6, Conclusion. Okay, so Jane Eyre is a wonderful novel. I think that the protagonist, Jane, is a great protagonist, one of the best that I've ever read. And the way that the story is told is unique and very intricate and detailed. If you like a novel where the protagonist is very much an integral part of the book, rather than just a dispassionate observer, then I think you'll find a lot to enjoy with this one. You really do get a feel for Jane as you go through the book. In terms of negatives, I would say that some plot elements are a bit silly and far-fetched, but aside from that, I think it's really good. I don't really have any negative things to say. I think it's a fantastic book. It's really well written, great characters, and a great story overall. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed this one, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for updates for new videos. I post every week on Mondays at 4 PM. Also, let me know in the comments what you think of Jane Eyre, and let me know how you think it matches up to Villette if you've read that novel as well. I look forward to discussing this with you guys in the comments, but until then, take care everyone, and I'll see you all in the next video.